have a lot of ground to cover today in this next 60 minutes that we are going to be together. And so it is a privilege and an honor to be with you and offer what hopefully will be some biblical comfort and counsel for you where you are at in this particular season of motherhood as you enter into the holidays. Let me go ahead and have Darby introduce herself. So, Darby, maybe share who you are and what you do and where you live, all that fun stuff.
Sure. My name is Darby Strickland. I'm a counselor and faculty member at the Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation. Reside outside of Philly, in Pennsylvania. Just a pleasure to be with you all.
All right. And then Eliza.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eliza, and I am the director of counseling at McLean Bible Church. So that's where I'm calling in from you to you guys today is from work. And I am a biblical counselor. I'm a licensed counselor. I've been in the field since around 2009, and I'm really excited to be able to share with you guys today.
And then we also have Lauren with us. So, Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren Whitman. I have the privilege of working with Darby also as a counselor and faculty member at the Christian Counseling and Educational Foundation. I also live outside of Philly with my husband and 2 children.
Awesome. Well, thank you, ladies, for joining us for this Help for the Holidays broadcast. I'm super excited to hear what you have to share today with us as we try to minister to moms who may be wrestling with overwhelming or distressing emotions going into the holiday. Maybe they are wanting to have some help with managing expectations and stress. And then also just remaining spiritually nourished as we are about to enter a season that usually requires a lot, right? A lot of giving, a lot of service for others. And so that's kind of what we'll be talking about during our time today. I want to first offer or invite Eliza to speak into the difficult holiday emotions that moms might experience. And so, Eliza, can you maybe help us to think briefly about why the holidays can be such a stressful time for moms?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it can be stressful for a lot of people, but I would say, and maybe because I'm a mother, I think it is especially stressful for moms. And that comes to my mind. I think of a couple of things. So my kids are older, but they weren't always older. And so I remember the days where moms basically play or they carry a lot of roles. They're the caretaker, they're the chef, they're the gift giver, they're the gift buyer, they're the organizer, they're the decorator a lot of the times. And I'm not saying dads don't do that, but in most cases, mom's kind of juggling those roles. We juggle them multiple roles throughout the year, but all the more so when the holidays come. And we're trying to create a sense of joy and togetherness. And I would say, speaking maybe to young moms, I'm guessing there's some young moms listening in. You can feel overwhelmed and maybe even nervous about the newness of these responsibilities. And yet, on the other hand, seasoned moms, we're not immune to those things. And we can feel the weight of like the traditions and the expectations and making the memory amazing. Can it top last year's kind of a thing? And we add to that the level of I'm going to call it unspoken competition that can creep in. And we really buy into the belief that our value comes from perfection or doing everything, the way other people are doing it, or that comparison. And we lose sight of the Lord and we lose sight of his peace. So releasing expectations can actually free us to embrace more of the messiness that happens in holidays, and that being just part of life, and knowing that our worth is not tied to that comparison. It's not tied to what other people are doing. But I will say, as a mom, that is easier said than done. And so my encouragement in navigating the stress that comes with holidays is, friends, speak truth to yourself. So remind yourself of the fact that life is not a competitive sport. I think we make it that, like, okay, I got to win on this, and maybe we don't say that, but we live like that. And know that in the midst of the chaos, there's always grace. There is always grace. So remember, and this is just an encouragement to older moms and younger moms, more seasoned moms and newer moms. Remember, it's okay to ask for help. And what I like to do is prioritize connection over perfection. And the same with my kids are learning this now. It's presence, actually being present with one another over presence, really, the gifts of everything. But so connection over perfection, and presence, or give or being present over presence, the gifts. So whether you're a young mom and you're just adjusting to the new rhythms, or you're maybe a seasoned mom carrying lots and lots of years of great memories, find rest in knowing that it's really about this love that we give to one another and the love that we receive. That is really important, and that can help alleviate some of that stress.
As I was listening to Eliza, I'm sitting here thinking about all the people, and there may be some on the call who have already started decorating for Christmas. Okay, and I've got my kids saying, "Mom, when are you going to decorate for Christmas?" And I'm like, I'm not ready for this. I'm not ready. I'm going to do that the day after Thanksgiving. And so, definitely the comparison trap and the pressure from just observing what other people are doing can certainly be a source of stress. Darby, I know another difficult holiday emotion, and I think probably one that is being experienced by many of the ladies who are on the call today, is the emotion or the feeling of grief or sadness. For them this year, or maybe every year around this time, they are dealing with just that sense of sorrow because of loss or whatever may be going on. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what makes the holidays particularly hard for grieving mothers.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, right, losing someone you love is the big category of grief that we often think about, and that's just heartbreaking. And holidays are just going to amplify that loss. The grief is painful, right? Precisely because someone precious to you now is gone. And there's no place for all that love you had for them actually to go. And it's really difficult. And again, as a mom, not only do you carry the burden of your own emotions and losses, but you have to now help your children navigate these things while you're wanting them to continue to have life and enjoy the life that God had gifted them. And that's just a lot of pressure swirling around in there. So I think any grief-filled person, right, feels the weight of trying to navigate their emotions. And then you add children in the mix, and then you have to think about how you're caring for their emotions, but also their day-to-day needs. And then you add like the demands of Christmas or holidays into that, right? It just can feel crushing, actually. And I think Eliza was saying it so well. When you're the person who feels the weight of keeping everything going, right? The holidays have long lists of all the things that need to be done. And so when you find yourself in, grief, whether you lost somebody or a home, all sorts of losses, right? You're just going to feel crushed. Your minds are going to be slower. Your hearts are heavy. You're just going to be tired. And the pressures of the holidays, right? They're not forgiving when we have all those demands on us. But I also think in our culture, there's this unspoken expectation of joy. And it can feel isolating, particularly if you're a grieving mom, right? There's this internal reality is contrasting sharply with how we feel we should be feeling, right? And I think that's hard. This is a season I should be happy. And then there's also the boomerang of the opposite, right? When you're living in a season of sorrow and you actually feel a spark of joy, then suddenly you feel guilt because you're not consumed by your sadness. So it's quite disorienting, actually. And then I want to just point out, like, adding to the idea that actually that holidays are packed with beautiful memories, right? And now those precious memories that you have are often very painful, right? And many of those memories are actually activated by our sensory experiences around the holidays, the songs we're hearing, the smells, the decorations, and the food, right? And they can bring back like these vivid memories of a loved one quite unexpectedly. And so it's disorienting. And things that once brought you joy, now in this particular season, at least right now, it's sorrow filled. So I think it's just having all that happening. And as a mom, you often don't feel that you can express your grief openly, right? You fear you're going to ruin your children's celebrations, or you feel like you're going to be a burden. So grief is not something that God wants you to carry alone, but I think moms often convince themselves that we need to be good for the sake of everyone around us. And that's just a horrible burden. And then lastly, I really want to point out, because I think it's something that we don't talk about, but that grief often strains relationships, right? And holidays are bringing people together, right? It's a time that your family and friends are gathering. But actually now many of those people are probably also suffering from that loss. And they're grieving, but they're probably grieving differently than you. And so your relationships that used to be a source of comfort are now terribly complicated, right? And some are actually really painful. And sometimes the people in our families don't know how to comfort us, right? And the words they actually offer you makes your pain harder. So again, holidays bring all those relationships together, and it's just a tremendous amount to navigate all at once. And so I think the way I think about it is loss in one way that we actually see all the effects of the fall are felt acutely and all at once, right? Life was not supposed to be this way when God made us. There wasn't supposed to be death. There wasn't supposed to be hurt or guilt. Family wasn't supposed to be a source of pain and confusion. And we feel all that even more intensely during the holidays, because as everything else is heightened, so is all the brokenness that we really feel in this world.
As she was talking, I was reminded of this like data, fact that like we get more counseling requests at our counseling center around and after the holidays, and I think it just really is a reflection of what Darby is describing, which is like there are so many hard, emotions that can come up around the holidays, and yeah, sometimes we need to reach out for help because they are so overwhelming. But also just wanting to highlight like that's normal, like normal in a sad way, that all these hard things come up. But certainly you're not alone if you are really struggling or wrestling during the holidays.
To echo that sentiment that you're not alone, before we even started this webinar call, we were up to 414 women who had registered to participate. We've got 111 here watching right now live, and even more that will be watching the replay. And so if you're here now and you're watching this video, there are other women here right now in this moment, and including the four of us, right? Other moms who know how layered this experience can be. I just even listening to Darby talk, and it reminds me of how much grace we need in this season and extending grace toward one another, and remembering that what you see on the surface, right, what you see on social media, what you see posted on pictures is not capturing the whole person and their reality and their experiences. And so just the amount of grace that is needed for moms and the holidays in particular, I think is an important reminder for all of us, just personally ourselves, but then also as we seek to be encouragements to our friends and people at church. Now, Lauren, another holiday emotion that we might not even really recognize that could be kind of churning under the surface is what you call, and you've written on actually quite a bit, this term mom guilt. And I'd love for you to take a minute and maybe help us think about how might mom guilt manifest itself this time of year.
Sure. Yeah. Let me quickly just first define how I use that phrase mom guilt. You guys have probably heard it at least, but importantly, like when we're talking about mom guilt, I'm talking about a kind of false and deceptive guilt. And I'm saying that in contrast to true guilt, which is what we feel after we have sinned and committed a moral failure. So mom guilt is deceptive in that it feels like true guilt, but in reality does not reflect a moral failure. So this is a somewhat silly example, but say your child's classroom is having a Christmas party and you sign up to bring cookies. Well, you'd love to bake homemade cookies because isn't homemade ideal, but you run out of time and you end up buying store-bought cookies. And so you show up to the party and you feel guilt that your cookies aren't homemade. And that would be an example of false guilt, right? Because you haven't sinned in bringing store-bought cookies, but you still are feeling badly for it. And part of the reason you might feel badly for it is because you had that ideal in your mind. You had that standard that you wanted to live up to, which is the standard that homemade is best. And you didn't meet that standard, and now you're struggling. And so seeking to reach standards is one way that mom guilt can manifest. But the good news here is that it's your standard. It's not God's standard, and it's not a moral failure before the Lord to bring store-bought cookies. And so it's going to be helpful for you to be oriented to that, to recognize what you're feeling. Okay, I'm feeling guilty for bringing these cookies. They're not as good as homemade, but also to acknowledge to yourself, but that's okay. This is not a failure. This is not a moral failure. And I also want to mention limitations here, because oftentimes we have mom guilt because we're limited. And being limited is also not a moral failure. To be limited is to be a creature. It's how God made us. So again, we'll keep extending this example. So with the Christmas cookies, you wanted to bake, but you ran out of time. You had a lot to juggle, a lot of balls in the air, and that just speaks to our limitations as moms. And all moms have limitations, and different moms have different limitations. So the cookie example, again, just a small example, but because the holidays are so busy and our calendars are fuller and our kids' behaviors might be more challenging as they deal with the excitement and overstimulation of the holidays, it's going to really be helpful when you're feeling guilty or badly to run through that question of, is this true guilt or is it false guilt? And if it's false guilt, to take a moment to discern, what is the expectation or standard that I'm measuring myself up against? And then to acknowledge that it is not a standard that you are beholden to. So to just receive the gift of that and let it go.
Lauren, it sounded like you were describing my morning. I don't know if anybody else can relate to that, but honestly, this morning I went to the store. We have a church potluck this Wednesday, tonight at 6 o'clock, right? Just a few hours from now. And I had considered store-bought cookies to bring to the church dinner. And our church, they know how to do a potluck, right? I mean, it is top-notch food there. And I had that like internal rustling of you can't dare bring store-bought cookies to a potluck at church. And so I'm making a chicken broccoli cheese casserole instead after this call. But
But the
so
good news the good news is you could have brought store-bought cookies, and
I
I
could
think
have.
that's okay.
I had to have that dialogue in the moment. And so, but I share that because your example and then me even being vulnerable and sharing that this is what I was contending with today, hopefully connects with the viewers because in offering us those categories, it helps us to process what is going on a little bit better. And then hopefully after we do, from a biblical worldview and of course the gospel, we come to land on a little more place of rest of like, okay, maybe it would be really nice if I had the time to do homemade stuff, but if time runs out, just the fact that we're going to be present, right? Like Eliza said, we're going to be present, and that's the present that I bring to the potluck. And maybe some cookies too is great. So thank you for offering a couple of categories for us to think about as we navigate the upcoming weeks and the church events and all the holiday meals. Now, why don't we go ahead and then segue into managing holiday expectations, which I think tails really nicely off of what Lauren was just talking about. Because like expectations, we may go into the holiday actually not even knowing that we have expectations for what our holiday is going to look like. We just know that things continue to not go our way, and then we continue to be very upset or frustrated or angry or, fill in the blank of whatever uncomfortable emotion you might feel when things aren't going as planned and there we are. And so I wonder as we think about managing holiday expectations, Eliza, can you help us to think about how setting realistic holiday expectations can actually help to mitigate the stress that we feel?
Sure. And I so appreciated what Lauren said because it just dovetails so much into what I'm about to share with you guys. But before I do, I'm sure maybe some of you saw recently on social media, there's been this recipe, which I think could really actually serve all of us. It's, I think, some kind of a Christmas dessert, and I'm sure it had a creative name, but it starts out with you don't preheat the oven. You don't need all of these different ingredients. You just get a casserole dish and you pour in one bag of peanut M&Ms, one bag of plain M&Ms, one bag of almond M&Ms, and you mix them together and they give you all the instructions on how to mix it together for 2 minutes, and then you take it and you have your dessert. So I'm right there with you, definitely feeling that what can I bring kind of feeling can add a lot of pressure. But I think as Lauren said, it is important that we navigate this in a way that actually embraces our limitations. And so I want to just kind of expound on that specifically as we move into the holidays. And I'm going to go a slightly different direction than maybe you think, because as you think about setting realistic holiday expectations, you're kind of thinking about, okay, what does it mean around the holidays? But I want you to think about setting realistic human expectations for yourself, because while, yes, setting realistic expectations around our limits is vital all year round, right? It's not just during the holidays. And so it does seem to weigh on us a bit more during Christmas, and moms can easily pour out themselves in every direction and having, a piece of us in every little thing that's going on, and we can feel exhausted and we can feel overwhelmed. And so when we are looking at what does it look like to set realistic human expectations around the holidays, I want you to think about the various things like your physical life. your emotional life, your relational life, especially during the holidays when you're seeing a whole lot of other people that maybe some of those relationships are strained, and your spiritual life, where do you see yourself running up against those limitations? And I think that's the first step, is you have to actually become aware of when I'm kind of starting to hit those limitations. So let's just talk physically for a second. How do I know when I'm hitting those limitations physically? And again, as Lauren said, like, this isn't a sin, or this is nothing wrong with you because you have limitations. This is actually the way the Lord has designed us. Our limitations point to the fact that we are created as dependent beings. So think of your little children. They are dependent on you when they're younger. And there's nothing wrong with them. When your child is dependent and you're looking at this little child who needs your help, you don't look at them and say, "What's wrong with you? Why do you need my help?" No, you're like, "Okay, let me help you because I know this is too much for you." And so we want to embrace that as a person, that these limitations are not sinful. They are actually God designed. So physically, you want to make sure you're aware. How do I know when I'm physically bumping up against those limitations? Well, your body will tell you. And if you don't listen to your body, eventually your body will force you to listen to it. So your body's going to tell you, but I want you to actually be thinking, what does your body tell you? What are some of the signs that your body kind of sends to you, like sends up the red flag when you've hit those limitations? And for me, a lot of times for me, it will be, I've noticed it in physical fatigue, in muscle aches and pains or headaches and things like that. And so first, I just want you to be aware of that, like listen to what your body is telling you. But the other thing that's so important to manage stress during the holidays is to actually give your body what it needs. And so I'm sure we've probably heard of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. But most people, if I ask them, I'm like, "Have you heard of those?" They all say yes, right? But then when I say, "Okay, tell me what the parasympathetic does and tell me what are the functions of those two?" They kind of are like, "Well, I know it has something to do with fight or flight," or something like that. And so the reason why I bring those up is because that's oftentimes one of the ways that our body tells us that we have hit those limitations, is one of those systems goes into effect. And that's usually the sympathetic nervous system, which is, in a sense, the part of the body that kind of starts to go into that fight or flight when things are overwhelming, whether emotionally or physically, or just even just there's the threat in the threat of overwhelm. And so we want to listen to that and actually do things that calm that down. So the sympathetic nervous system, I want to say, is like the gas pedal, and the parasympathetic is the brake. And so as we move into the holidays, what are some ways that you can actually activate the parasympathetic nervous system physically as you hit these limitations? By attending to your body and being able to pump those brakes. And so a couple of the things that I'll mention is recognizing that we need time with the Lord. We need time to be able to be poured into from God, because we will pour out whatever is inside of us. And so being able to have that time with the Lord, being able to do things that are physically helpful for your body to kind of calm down. So taking a walk, taking some time by yourself when needed is not a sin. It's actually you being that child saying, "I need help." And so I like to give myself cues, because I need them. And one of the ways that recently I've been giving myself a cue is with my phone, because our phones are with us all the time, right? And I have recently been dealing with an injury in my arm, and it gets exacerbated when I hold my phone in that hand. So I actually changed my wallpaper to just say left hand. I need to put it in my left hand because it's so natural for me to keep going even through the pain. And we do that even in the holidays. Like, we just keep pushing through our limitations. So my encouragement to you is do something that's going to stop you in your tracks. So maybe instead of putting left hand on your phone like I did, put a passage of scripture or just a simple prayer that you can just look at and see. This, the simple prayer of "I need help" or "I need you," is just that reminder of going to the Lord in those places, so that you not just are acknowledging your limitations, but you're actually attending to them. So I mentioned you need to notice them, you need to actually be aware of them, but then you need to attend to them, because if you don't attend to them, it will build up. And I always say, if you do not make time for your rest, you will have to make time for your exhaustion. It's just the way it works. And so just a couple things for you to be thinking about. It's the same. I kind of went with the physical side of things because I think this time of year we can kind of feel it physically or maybe emotionally, but the same is true relationally. If you've kind of met that limit, if you've kind of feeling overwhelmed, even relationally, it's okay to step away. It's okay to seek the Lord in that moment, to get some time away, not just by yourself, but with God, and to remember what he says, be still and know that I am God. And that's true of all the limitations that we have. But those kind of things, actually being aware and then attending to them, can actually help to mitigate the stress, especially during the holidays, because it's definitely a season where it shows up a lot more.
Yeah, I just appreciated Eliza's thoughts there, and also like wanted to highlight that, she's encouraging moms to like notice and attend to themselves, which moms can feel guilty for, right? Because we see so many other needs. So to stop and do something for yourself can be actually an occasion for mom guilt, right? So just, yeah, appreciate her giving permission, and how she framed it, which is that you are also a child, mom, and that means you are also in need of care, and you are also needy. But that is not something that God looks down upon us, because it's just a fact of how he made us. So that's really helpful.
Let me go ahead and offer, Eliza, and fits in. So the Spirit is guiding this conversation, because as Eliza was talking, it made me think of Psalm 103. And Eliza mentioned, about a prayer that you might, say in the moment to kind of, the two A's, what was it?
Yeah, aware and attend.
Aware. I was just say acknowledge. Okay. Aware and attend. But Psalm 103:14. I'm sorry, 13 and 14. Let me just read that real fast, because this may be the perfect prayer, or at least the verse to call to mind in those moments. The reminder that the psalmist says, as a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. What a beautiful reminder as we think about limitations this holiday season, and the rest that God gives to us by just helping us to remember who we are in Him and how He views us. And so I want to segue now over to Darby, because when you're dealing with grief in the holidays, that is a whole nother animal in terms of, what is this holiday going to even look like for me? What is it going to look like for us as a family if this is a new loss that we're navigating? So, how might a grieving mother set realistic expectations for her holiday season?
Yeah, and I think again that category of limitations really applies again, right? But now your limitations are actually shaped by your sorrow, right? And so I think it's just even helpful to keep thinking along that category, and just recognize when you lose someone, it also just ushers in many other losses, right? Things are different. Your capacity is different. Your children are impacted. And so you're going to have to do things differently, which is actually another loss. And so I think it's really just helpful to take time back, right? Doing some of that evaluating, evaluate your family traditions and your calendars. And you're going to have to decide what feels particularly important. And you're going to have to be realistic in assessing what's actually going to be manageable. And so you're going to have to cut things out, and things that's going to be disappointing. It's going to be hard, and it's going to bring up other losses, right? But I think you got to be just realistic and saying, what things can I enter into, and what things are going to be too painful or too costly for me to do in this season. So again, we're evaluating, but I think it's also helpful to just evaluate what you're trying to achieve, right? And so it gives you the opportunity to focus on the small. You're probably going to have to do the simple things, right? The heartfelt actions. Maybe it's just reading Luke 2 with your family or praying with them. This isn't going to be a year for the perfect tree or, tons of homemade cookies, as we were saying. It's going to look different. And when we think about Christmas, right, it's about Jesus entering into our brokenness and our pain. And actually, he's come to put an end to death. So in a sense, what actually feels hard to make these changes. It's actually an opportunity, I would say, to actually focus on what the Lord would have you focus on, his coming. And so in some ways, it's a sweet way that grief can actually help you reorient your priorities. Again, giving yourself permission to adapt certain traditions, but also just thinking about, again, how you might honor your loved one, and because God wants you to remember them. They were a gift to you and others. And so again, traditions are changing, your expectations are changing. And I think, as I talked about, a lot of those relational tensions, right, surrounding expectations that we're talking about, you want to help others in letting them know what you can and can't do, right? And so that means you have to be honest with yourself and others, and just saying, this holiday is going to be hard for me, and these are the things I can participate in, and I know it's going to be a disappointment that I can't do these things. And so I think it's just helpful to be upfront with people in your community about what's going to be different. And again, some of you might enjoy being in a large gathering where you can be small. Some of you large gatherings are going to feel overwhelming, right? And you're going to want those more intimate things. And so it's a season to say, just ask the Lord, help me know myself well, as Eliza is saying, where am I going to be able to be supported? What's going to feel tolerable and doable? And how do I embrace that? By recognizing I am limited. One is just to let the people who love you care for you, invite them in with specific things, right? Can they pick you up groceries, or can they make the homemade cookies for your family? Can they go shopping with you to pick up gifts? Because that could just be overwhelming. Or maybe you're sending them out, right, to Target with your list because you don't have the strength to do it. And so I think it's just really, recognizing because I can't doesn't mean that someone can't help me. And so again, you're prioritizing what you need, and giving yourself the ability to just reflect, the time to grieve, but really saying to other people, help me here, because these are the things I have deemed important, and I do want to execute them well.
That's so good. I was thinking as you were talking about that too, of just Mark Vrogop, who was at the CCEF conference this past year, and he's written on grief and lament. And he talks about lament being a prayer of pain that leads to trust. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking about how many of our traditions are really like they're great and we love them, but they do create an expectation of this is going to be the same. And how much does grief actually change everything from being the same? Everything is now different, like you were saying. And so our traditions can feel hard because it's like, how do we do this in this different space now? And yet being able to, and that can be scary. And that can not just be scary in the sense of like, I don't know what to do, but like really in our faith, it can be like, Lord, what is this going to look like? How will this ever be as good as it was before? And that's where that lament comes in, of just that prayer of pain that leads to trust. We're going to trust God in this space that is so different. I thought that was so important what you said about it's going to look different, and yet our traditions remind us of the same. And so it's a challenging time, but it's that space where we're in that transition where we can actually say, okay, what does it look like for me to pray these things to the Lord so that I can trust him with what it will look like in this different space? And that turning that into that lament of longing for what was, but trusting him for what will be. It's so good.
And giving yourself permission to grieve all the smaller losses that come with the bigger loss.
Yeah.
I think is super important in what you're saying. Talk to God about not just the big loss, but all the smaller losses.
Yep.
They're equally as important to him.
Mm-hmm.
I also really appreciate, Darby, you giving moms permission to ask for help, because that can be another place where we struggle, especially for moms, because we're so used to serving and, giving sacrificially. So to need help can feel like we're doing something wrong. And yet, I think one of the themes here that we're gathering today is like, Mom, you are also a person who needs care, and you deserve care. And if you're grieving something so heavy, let people care for you because you deserve that. And the Lord loves you, and let him love you through his people. And that's actually a blessing to his people to be able to serve you. And so let's not think like the world thinks about it, which is like, to need help is a sign of weakness. It's like, no, let the body of Christ come around you and love you and surround you, because you are worth that kind of care as you grieve. So thank you for highlighting that.
Seems like one of the tricky things with holiday grief or sadness or even depression is the fact that it can in and of itself cause us to feel guilty for even feeling grieved or sad or depressed.
Mhm.
And so that is something that can be very tricky to navigate, because we may have listeners right now who are walking through sadness, sorrow, grief, depression, and they are feeling the weight of that guilt of like, I'm bringing my family down,
Mhm.
right? Or I am impeding my family's happiness in this season. It should be joyous for them, but here I am, and I feel like, I can't even smile any or laugh anymore right now. And so that can bring a sense of guilt for the woman who is struggling in that particular way. And so, Lauren, I want to invite you to kind of speak into that, because, again, you're like our mom guilt expert here on this panel. But I think it's an important part of the conversation, even to consider, as we're thinking about expectations and all of these difficult emotions, and how guilt can interact with some of that. I think you can offer us right now, no pressure. You're going to offer us some good news, though, hopefully, on helping us to think about, well, what are God's expectations? Like, does God expect grieving and sad or stressed out moms to just go through the holidays happy? Like, are we failing God because we're not bouncing and full of happiness? Or maybe is there something else to it? So how do God's expectations give us comfort and some guidance to moms who are wrestling with that this holiday season?
Yes, I do. I do have good news. And yeah, he is just such a good father to us. So there is this one. There are these two verses in Psalm 147 that I want to read to you because they've been really instructive to my heart as I think about God's expectations. It reads, "He does not delight in the strength of the horse. He takes no pleasure in the legs of a man. The Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, in those who hope in his mercy." And so, what I love about this verse is how it really turns upside down our idea of what God is looking for. He's not looking for strength or capability or success, but his delight is in those who fear him and put their hope in his unfailing love. And that is indeed good news for all of us because really it's an invitation to rest in him and what he has done. Because to fear him is to know him, to love him, to acknowledge that he alone is God, that he alone is strong and mighty, and we are his creatures, we are his dependent children, as Eliza mentioned earlier. And that means we don't have to be strong and mighty because he made us to be dependent on him for our strength and for our might. And that strength and might is not something we need to manufacture or conjure up on our own. We look to him for that. And as we do look to him for that, he is delighted by that. He is delighted to be our Father whose children look to him in faith. So as we think about his expectations, remember that God's kingdom, it's an upside down kingdom. It's not what you'd expect. And remember how Jesus himself described what it's like to be in a relationship with him, which was, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." And so, as we look to God in faith, as we rely on him to be our strong father and release ourselves of the burden of high expectations that we place on ourselves, we learn to walk lightly. We learn to walk freely because our God's yoke is easy and his burden is light. And that means you don't have to take on burdens that are too big for him because you're in relationship with a strong and mighty God who willingly offers to carry those for you. So that is the good news for moms. And so in those places that you start to feel pulled or overwhelmed or overstimulated this holiday season, I invite you to remember that invitation from Jesus that he says, "Take my yoke, let me carry your burdens," and know that as you do, he is delighted because it is your Father's good pleasure for us to find our rest in him.
That was also in line with another scripture that I was thinking of from Micah 6:8, where it says, "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." And when we think about these things, the verses that we're talking about, it's like, is it within your power today to do what God, to do what God is calling you to do, to love? Is it within your power today to steward your love to somebody else? There may be a lot of things that you don't have the time and capacity to be able to do, in this season, even as you grieve or you're sad, right? But you have the love of Christ, and you can give it to somebody else. And whatever that looks like will be, different based on what our capacities are and giftings and all of that. But that's, I think, kind of my default when I feel overwhelmed is, okay, I know for sure God's calling me to love someone. I might not know a lot about other things, but I know that He has put it within my power to do something with that love and to give it to someone is a way of walking in faithful obedience in the midst of my overwhelming moments. So thank you guys so much for helping us to think a little bit more, hopefully more biblically and clearly about managing holiday expectations. Anyone else have anything to add to that before we move on? Well, we've got one more segment here in about 15 minutes, and I think we're going to be just fine on our time. And so this is going to be hopefully a refreshing conversation coming up. I'm going to have Eliza start us off as we think about what it looks like or what it can look like to stay spiritually nourished this season. Which kind of sounds like, wait a minute, how is that even possible? Like my schedule today is crazy. Your schedule today is probably crazy too. How do we stay spiritually nourished with all of the additional holiday activity that's already being tacked onto what is, possibly already a jam-packed schedule just without the holidays? And so, Eliza, what might spiritual nourishment look like in the context of holiday stress?
Sure. I'm a little hesitant to give just like this is what it will look like because I don't want it to be like a formula. Here is what you need to do, and you will have just that nourishment that you need during holiday chaos or whatever. So I'll give you a general maybe some general direction, and I'd love for you guys to think about it, but I'd also love for you guys to, if you're listening with a group, great, talk amongst yourselves afterwards about some of these things. But if you're listening individually, to bring somebody else into it, into even what the conversation can look like, to basically create a space in your life for intentional spiritual nourishment during the chaos and the busyness of holidays. And the way that I'm going to present it is, like I said, more general, but I think it can be applied in various ways. And there's so many resources that you could use to kind of help yourself with this. But I am going to encourage you guys, if you haven't done this before, or if you have done it before, to do it with more intention. But that is to take up the idea of Advent practices. And Advent begins December 1st. So you've got a little bit of time to kind of prepare for that. You've got, like I said, there's gobs of resources. I was just noticing today, I think it was New Growth Press or 10 of those had a whole list of Advent books. I'm like, I want every single one of them, but I didn't buy them all. I'm tempted to, though. Choose one or find one thing to do. That there's lots of apps for this as well, but just it doesn't even, you don't even have to have a resource. You can just decide, I'm going to set aside every day from December 1st to December 25th to be intentional about creating a countercultural rhythm. And that's really what we're trying to do in the midst of the holiday hustle, because holidays are busy. So creating space already goes against that like constant rush of have to do this today and what's my to-do list look like. So in the busyness, even the simplest Advent practices can be so helpful. Things like daily readings that focus your heart can offer that spiritual nourishment that we need. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be intentional. So one of the things that I've done recently, until I ran out of them, I got this little box of they called them meditation candles, and essentially they're little tiny candles that burn for 20 minutes and then they're done. And I, for 2 weeks, just read my Bible from candlelight. I am an early riser. Doesn't make me better or worse than anybody, just the way my body naturally wakes up very early. And so it's often dark. And I thought, I'm just going to use these to kind of light my Bible, which meant I wasn't using my phone to read my Bible, which I often will do. And just that shift, that intentional shift, which is a little bit of a change, that slowing down, was very helpful and really gave me a sense of deeper connection to that time, that reading time. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be intentional. So take a moment each day to do something that draws your heart and mind to reflect on Christ's arrival. And if this is something you haven't done before, let this year be the year that you start to do some kind of Advent engagement. And let me encourage you, though, to invite others into it. So, as I mentioned, even before I started talking, like my encouragement was take what I'm about to say and talk with somebody else about it. But then also consider bringing somebody else into that conversation more than just let's talk about it, but like invite them to do it with you. So, especially moms, is there another mom that you can join with? Another mom who you are maybe are in the same season of life, or maybe they're in a different season. So if you're an older mom, maybe it's a younger mom that you want to say, I want to come alongside you and help build some space where we can kind of be a little bit more intentional. Maybe it's just 5-10 minutes that we're going to be reading the same thing and then we're going to chat about it. Or if you're a younger mom, don't hesitate to ask that older mom that you really look up to maybe do it with you, or somebody in your same season of life. Sometimes that can just be easier because you're kind of on the same schedule, and maybe you'll see each other at drop off line or whatever that looks like. But bring another mom into it to join you, and it can be as simple as we're just going to text. We're going to be reading the same. You're going to be reading through Luke chapter 2, and you're just going to share what verse today stood out to you as we read it this day, and just, it can be simple as a quick text or a quick prayer that you might share with somebody, but embrace the small moments of quiet together. And you don't have to be doing it together, but knowing, I don't know about you, but there is something about knowing somebody else is doing it too that helps. And I'll give this quick example because it came to light last year. This time of year, actually, my grandson was born on, you didn't think I'd be able to get through this whole thing without mentioning my grandson, did you? But he was born on Christmas Eve. And my daughter-in-law, just so great. She wanted us to, both me and her mother, to be there. And what was interesting about this, and I don't know if this is the way they always do it in hospitals, but in her particular hospital, her monitor, which had her heart rate and her baby's heart rate, was up on the screen, like, and it monitors the contractions and everything. But then there was about 6 other ladies who were in the labor and delivery ward, and their heart rates were also up there. And I thought that was interesting. No names or anything like that, but it created a sense of solidarity because we could see that person, we could see their contractions, and we'd be like, "Oh, she's having a hard one. We got to pray for her." And it created this sense of solidarity that actually kind of helped keep my daughter-in-law going in some of the harder moments. It's like there's other people with me doing this. So we're not delivering babies, at least I'm not, maybe some of you are, but do this together. Find something that you can do together with another mom in this season that is marked by stress and distractions and pressure to perform and just overwhelming hustle. Commit with another person to say, I want to slow down. And for these days, I want to set aside that time to be intentionally thinking about the Lord, his coming, what that means for me, and let Advent be an invitation to slow down. And I just want to read this passage of scripture because sometimes it's one of those things where it's like, I just need something to hold on to. And as we were even reading, Psalm 62 came to my mind. And it says this, it says, for God alone, O my soul, waits in silence. How often do we do that? Do we wait in silence? I don't know about you, but it gets really uncomfortable in silence. And if I were to stop talking right now, we'd all get really uncomfortable, right? So we need to embrace this, that God is calling us to actually that space. For God alone, my soul waits in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is my God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. So he's talking about him, it being my salvation and my rock, but then he says it's for us. And so I do think leaning into Advent practices, but doing it in community is going to be really a valuable thing.
That's awesome. Thank you for offering that insight. I never thought about doing it in community, in particular, the Advent practice. So that is definitely something to chew on as we think about this. And but Darby, I'm having you kind of be the one who speaks into grief and sorrow. And so I wonder if you could give us maybe in just a couple minutes a short glimpse into what spiritual nourishment might look like in the context of walking through grief this holiday season.
Yeah, I think it's just a little more challenging, right? Because Christmas says to us, celebrate. We're supposed to celebrate the Lord's coming. And that's going to be really hard, right, to be celebrating. But I think we actually can lean into the truth that Emmanuel means God is with us, right? And so we can actually reflect on the fact that the Lord is with us, right? That he is here in this broken world to bring us comfort and redemption. And his presence is actually the strength that we draw on. But how do we do that, right? I think we know Psalm 34 says, like, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and he saves the crushed in spirit. But earlier on, and that's like a great, I would say just a great comfort, right? That he's near. And that's what Christmas is telling us, that he is near. But I think ways to do that is really, it's difficult, to be honest. So earlier in Psalm 34, it talks about tasting and seeing that the Lord is good. And as Eliza was saying, being deliberate about that is just going to be much more difficult. So I just think there's like creative ways to do that, where in your environment, there's going to be Christmas music. And actually, a lot of Christmas hymns actually acknowledge the deep sorrow. Joy to the world, like for the Lord has come, is this great triumphal hymn. But actually, the stanza, one of the stanzas that always impresses me is it says, let no more sins and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. Right? His blessings, he comes to make his blessings flow as far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found. And right, and that's when you're in grief, you're living in the reality of the curse. And so even Christmas music has this beautiful victory, but it also acknowledges the sorrows. Another one is Away in the Manger, right? It's just, we think of this as a sweet Christmas hymn. But again, like the last stanza says, be near me, Lord Jesus, I ask thee to stay close by me forever. Sorry, I get emotional. And love me, I pray, right? Bless all thee dear children in thy tender care, and fit us for heaven to live with thee there. So I think there's just all these really sweet ways in our Christmas traditions that we don't notice when we're not in sorrow. We kind of probably brush past them. But actually, yeah, just be looking for that. Another way to look for it and to direct your heart towards worship, I guess is what I'm saying, tasting and seeing that the Lord is good, is helping your heart catch, right? And seeing the Lord is near. And that's asking the Lord to help us worship in the sorrow. Another really simple thing is Christmas lights, right? They penetrate the darkness. That's what makes them so beautiful. And so, yeah, you have a Lord who loves you enough that he's penetrating the darkness. And so I just look at some of those normal things that we take for granted in our Christmas traditions and think about, how do they help me see who the Lord is? And how can that actually be a comfort to me? And again, it's just that idea of, you actually have, I think, as everyone is saying here, you have this daddy in heaven, right, who wants you to crawl into his lap and hold on to you while you're crying. He wants to hear about your fears, your angers, your anxieties, and your sadness. And so ask him, talk to him, find that one verse to cling to, but ask to him, in my environmental world, as I'm running into Christmas music and ornaments and Christmas lights, help me direct my gaze to you, because that's going to be particularly difficult in this season, because you're going to have to see through so much pain. So ask him to embrace your tears and hold you in that, but ask him to help you see something different than just your sorrow.
Thank you so much, Darby. I mean, even built into the Christmas story in Luke 1:79, we're reminded of the reason of Jesus's coming, right? Is because of the tender mercy of God, right? He sent his son to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace. So even the Christmas story itself does not turn a blind eye to the fact that there are those right now on this call who feel like they are sitting in the darkness and in the shadow of death. And this is why Jesus came, is to give light to those who are in those desperate places.
It's just such good news, right? And the good news that God has not forgotten us, but in fact sent his son to us, and that he was willing to endure this life to be able to sympathize with our weaknesses. So all of the things that we might face, anything you might face this holiday season, the Lord is familiar with it. And as Christine quoted earlier, Psalm 103, and in the midst of whatever that you end up experiencing, remember that he is a father who has compassion on you. And that is just a very, very sure thing that will not change. And so may we just all grow in receiving his love and his comfort and his compassion for us.
Well, thank you, Lauren. And as I expected, this hour flew by. And so I wish we could stay another hour to talk more about this. But hopefully, what we shared today was a help to you as you enter into the holiday season. Thanks again for being with us today, for making the time. Thank you to all of our panelists, Lauren and Eliza and Darby. And I hope that this call served you well. If you have any feedback, I'd love to hear from you directly. Happy holidays, friends.